Happy birthday. Ready? Your birthday today? Yeah, it's your birthday, everybody.
I was gonna say,
What?
I don't want to sit down, and that means I'm staying. And I need to go to the tuition. I don't know how. I'm like,
What is that?
How does Jerry say? Yeah. No, that's why I'm not going to. I wasn't going to. They're doing side hustles. They just want the one you should do. So I'm going to go next week.
Anybody still taking the quiz? Is anyone still taking the quiz? Okay, fantastic. Yeah.
If I get my rib put back in place, didn't no one get sore the day after.
All right. How was the quiz? Okay. Try to be very present. And really, the quizzes are just designed to make sure that you're keeping up with the conversation. If you're understanding the basic ideas, which is good because the subject of our second talk is basic ideas. What we also call the first principles. We're going to use Ralph W. Stevenson's long deductive argument as an example to study first principles and the basic ideas of logic, including premises and conclusions and major minor principles and so forth. Stevenson's argument is one of the most, if not the most foundational idea in the traditional philosophy of chiropractic. This class is about logic and epistemology, but it's also about our beloved profession. It's also chiropractic. Okay? How do we become good chiropractors? Well, we have to attend to what has come before us. We have to understand the arguments that chiropractors before us have made, the ways that they understand concepts like universal intelligence and innate intelligence. I just had a great conversation in the break about the nature of innate intelligence. In 1927, Ralph Stevenson published the chiropractic textbook, and it was intended to be such. It's divided into 4 sections: freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior, because it's meant to be studied in that order by chiropractic students at the Palmer School. In the freshman text, In the introduction, in fact, Ralph Stevenson gives some definitions, including definitions of science, art, and philosophy, of axioms. He makes his case little by little, and he leads up to a long, deductive syllogism. The word syllogism is a fancy word for an argument, but it's a very particular kind of argument. It's a deductive argument that begins with an assumption. And then deductively moves by inference to a conclusion. It's saying, if this is true, that's what we mean by an assumption, right? If this is true, then the following must also be true. And if that's true, this other thing must be true, and ultimately leads down to a conclusion. 33 steps is what Stevenson can make this argument. Now let's be honest with ourselves. If you're engaged in conversation with a friend and you're trying to make an argument, and it takes you 33 steps to do it, you're never going to get through it because your friend's going to walk away before you get halfway through it, right? That's a long argument. Why would it take Stevenson so long? Well, we're going to look at the argument. We're going to reason that out. What's so important about Stevenson's argument was that it took the metaphysical ideas that B.J. Palmer presented in his green books and all the volumes of the green books up to that point, and it pulled it all together in a way that made sense. That had never been done before. Okay? So consider this. You could read hundreds, maybe thousands of pages of B.J. Palmer and D.D. Palmer and try to understand chiropractic philosophy. Or by 1927, you could read one logical argument and get all of it. That's what Stevenson attempted to do. The question is twofold. First, was he successful in really bringing together B.J. and D.D.'s ideas? The second question is more fundamental. Is it true? Well, what rubric do we have to establish whether it's true? Well, we have three different criteria, or three different theories of truth that we can use, right? That is the correspondence theory, does it match with reality? The coherence theory, do all of the statements within the argument agree with one another? And the pragmatist theory, does it actually do anything for us? Does it give us any value? Does it hold up under scrutiny? That's the pragmatist theory. Let's begin with first principles. McInerney says this: the science is an organized body of knowledge. Remember that logic is a science and an art. It's an organized body of knowledge that's possessed of first principles. The first principles of any science are those fundamental truths upon which the science is founded, and by which all its activities are informed. Logic is a science. As a science, has its first principles. But logic stands in a unique relationship to all other sciences because the first principles of logic apply not just to logic, but to all the sciences. That's a profound statement. Let me pause here for a moment. If I asked you to think of a science, what would you come up with? Think of a science, any science. What would you come up with? You guys, give me an example. Biochemistry. It's a great example. There are a lot of statements in biochemistry. Glycolysis is a series of statements. And there's a collective growth in the crowd. Am I right? Whether or not those statements are true comes down to first principles. You get what I'm saying? Logic is also built on first principles, but its principles apply to all other sciences. If biochemistry is illogical in the way that it's put together, careful now. Careful. If biochemistry is illogical in the way that it's put together, then it's false. Does that make sense? Its ideas would have to correspond with reality. That's the correspondence theory. Its ideas would have to be internally consistent. They would have to agree with each other. That's the coherence theory. Or they would have to have some utility, some usefulness to us. Does this make sense? Hold up under scrutiny, under investigation. This is what Ralph Stevenson says about the same thing. The principles of a science are its governing laws. These may be the fundamental truths upon which it is founded, or the governing rules of conduct or operation. So Stevenson and McInerney agree on the importance of first principles. McInerney says, the first principles of logic And the first principles of human reason can be said to refer to the same thing. When we apply human reason, which, in my own opinion, is all that really separates our species from every other species on the planet, is our use of reason. What we're doing is we're trying to establish truth. We're trying to come up with clear ideas. We're trying to communicate those clear ideas so that they can work collectively together. Those are the same first principles of logic. These articles here, A-R-T period, that means article, they come from Stevenson's textbook. He says, axioms, definition, that which is thought-worthy, that which is assumed, a basis of demonstration, principle, very much like what McInerney is describing. Article 22 from Stevenson, he defines principles as, quote, a fundamental truth, a comprehensive law or doctrine from which others are derived, or on which others are founded. A general truth, an elementary proposition, a maxim, an axiom, a postulate. So, axioms and principles are very much the same, almost synonymous, but they're fundamental truths on which we can build other ideas. Something real about the world, a clear idea, a truth about the world that we can then build other truths. Stevenson is going to use these principles in that long deductive argument to say something ultimately true about innate intelligence and about chiropractic. The principle of identity. We need to know some basic rules of logic. These are basic principles in the way that Stevenson just described. The principle of identity. Here's a statement. A thing is what it is. You guys have heard this before. People ask you, well, you're telling some story about something that happened. What can you ultimately say about it? Well, it is what it is. I've never liked that phrasing. Personally, because it's a tautology, T-A-U-T, ology, tautology. What does that mean? Tautology means it is a redundant statement. It's saying the same thing over again. It is what it is. Couldn't you have simply said, it is, and meant the same thing? Right? It is. It is what it is in the principle of identity means something slightly different. Okay? I'm going to try to parse this out. Here's the explanation. The whole of existing reality, that means everything that we could possibly experience, is not a homogeneous mass. It's not all just the same exact thing. It's composed of individuals, and the individuals are distinguishable from one another. If a thing is what it is, obviously, it is not something other than what it is. An apple is an apple. It's not an orange or a banana or a pear. This goes back to McInerney's commitments, realism. The chair is the chair is the chair. If what I'm seeing here is actually the case. Okay? This is as it appears to me. That's what he means by it is what it is. Does that make sense? It actually is as it appears to me. This is from Stevenson. Article 16, Theories and Facts. His definition of a fact, the quality or character of being actual, or of being made up of facts. Actuality, often specific physical actuality or practical experience, as distinguished from imagination or speculation or theory. As the realm of fact is distinct from fancy, a question of fact, that is, of actual evidence rather than hypothesis. What Stevenson is saying here about theories and facts is much like what McInerney is saying about the principle of identity. When we're talking about facts in the world, we're talking about things as they actually are, not ideas about them that come out of our imagination. They're not speculation. They're not hypothesis. It is as it appears to us. Okay? Then there's the principle of the excluded middle. Okay? Between being and non-being, there is no middle state. It either exists or it doesn't exist. There is no in-between. That's the whole principle. It either exists or it doesn't exist. That's it. Think about how this might apply to the notion of innate intelligence. It either exists or it doesn't exist. There is no in-between. Okay? Please don't ask me about quantum mechanics right now.
Where is
McNamee would say either the person is truly experiencing the thought, or they're not. It either exists in the mind of the subject, or it's not, or it doesn't. Okay? Now, I made the statement just now, don't ask me about quantum mechanics, because of course this gets completely thrown upside down when you start studying quantum mechanics. When things can seem to exist and not exist simultaneously. But we're not going there right now. All right? So what is the principle of the excluded middle? Something exists or it doesn't exist, and that's it. The principle of sufficient reason is the idea that everything that exists has some reasonable explanation for its existence. Okay? That's it. If it's the case that you're sitting in this chair right now, there has to be some explanation as to how you ended up in this chair right now. That's the principle of sufficient reason. It is a reason, an explanation, sufficient to describe every actual fact existing in the world. Does this make sense? So that there aren't any phenomena in the world that are completely unexplainable. Does this make sense? Have you ever seen, it's kind of a funny example, you ever seen the old Scooby-Doo cartoon?
Yes.
Okay? And at the end, there's always the big reveal when they pull the mask off the monster, right? And there's always some sufficient reason as to why all of these apparently paranormal events were occurring. Turns out it wasn't so spooky after all. There's some reason sufficient to all of the effects, to all the phenomena. And everything makes sense. That's the principle of sufficient reason. Okay? Stevenson talks in Article 21 about the missing link. Chiropractic as a science and art is based upon the link between mind and matter. We can say that since all phenomena is the result of force in matter, and since the major premise of chiropractic maintains that this force proceeds from intelligence, then the link is force. It is called the missing link because it is unrecognized as the bond between immaterial and material until discovered by chiropractic. Stevenson here is providing a principle of sufficient, based on the principle of sufficient reason, an explanation of phenomena in the world. How do things come to exist the way that they are? By the application of force. This is what Stevenson is saying. It follows from the principle of sufficient reason. What's the explanation of things? Without the principle of sufficient reason, we get phenomena occurring in reality that have no explanation. That becomes utterly illogical. Does that make sense? There has to be some explanation for everything. That's the principle of sufficient reason. Okay? Sometimes I question that as a father. Why is there water all over the floor? No one can tell me. You're telling me there's no reason why there's water all over. Checks the plumbing's not leaking. Checks the drain isn't leaking. No one has an explanation for how there came to be an inch of water on the floor. So the principle of sufficient reason apparently holds throughout the entire universe unless you have kids, and then it completely falls apart. Let's talk about the principle of non-contradiction. It's impossible for something both to be and not be at the same time and in the same respect. Think about the earlier principle of the excluded middle. It either exists or it doesn't exist, right? That's correct. That's the principle that we talked about earlier. Non-contradiction is saying something different. It's saying it cannot both exist and not exist at the same time. That would be contradictory. And not be at the same time and in the same respect. Here's the explanation. This principle could be regarded as a fuller expression of the principle of identity, where X is X, the principle of identity. It cannot at one and the same time be non-X. That's the principle of contradiction. The phrase, in the same respect, in the statement refers to the mode of existence in question. There'd be no contradiction if something both was and was not at the same time in different respects. What? Okay. It's like this. If you said, let's take this sign, for instance. I like this example because it says, do not enter and enter only. This is the kind of sign that I would come across in Alabama if I were driving somewhere. What am I supposed to do in this scenario? I'm just going to turn around, do a three-point turn, and go a different direction. There's nothing to do here. There's no way to make this work. That's the principle of non-contradiction, okay? Or a violation of it. But let's use an object like my keys, okay? According to non-contradiction, the keys either exist or they don't exist. We've already talked about that. We understand that. But it would not be a contradiction for my keys to exist and someone else's keys to also exist at the same time. Because they're different, right? They both exist, but in different respects. Or maybe these keys exist, but they're different from the same, from how these keys could be in some different respect, right? So as long as there's some distinguishing quality between two objects, then it doesn't violate the law of contradiction, or the principle of contradiction. Yep.
What would you say about passive aggressive?
Passive aggressiveness is more of a psychological tool, right? It's a deliberate manipulative technique. So it doesn't hold in the sense of the principle of non-contradiction. This deals with real objects. Okay. Concrete objects. Here's an example. Two statements are in contradiction if what one says completely negates what the other one says. A. Alexander Hamilton was a member of George Washington's cabinet. Statement B. Alexander Hamilton was not a member of George Washington's cabinet. But both of these statements cannot be true. If one is true, then the other is false, and vice versa. As it happens, of course, A is true, therefore B is false. This is how logic works. So when you're confronted with a sign that says do not enter and enter only, they seem to completely contradict the other. Well, which one is actually the case? Because whichever one is actually the case will be the true statement and will negate the other. In this example here, it is the case that Alexander Hamilton was a member of Washington's cabinet. Therefore, A is true and B is false. Well, how did we get there? By the correspondence theory of truth. Which one of them actually corresponds with reality? And it's statement A. The word contradiction comes from two Latin roots, contra, meaning against, and dicere, meaning to speak. A contradictory statement, in effect, speaks against itself before it is saying something that does not correspond to the objective facts. It does not correspond to reality. In Stevenson's book, he talks about paradoxes and says, a tenet of proposition contrary to received opinion. Also, an assertion or sentiment seemingly contradictory or opposed to common sense, but that yet may be true in fact. So I'm going to just explain Stevenson's definition here, which he borrowed from Webster's dictionary, by the way. Paradoxes are those things that seem to run against, speak against, our intuitions about reality. Okay? Look at the picture here. This is a drawing by the artist M.C. Escher. And it seems like there's stairs that go to nowhere, and there's sets of stairs that defy reality. That's a kind of example of what goes against, runs contra to our intuitions about reality. It's paradoxical. Sometimes there are statements that seem to be paradoxical, and we have to work it out. One of my favorite paradoxes in the study of logic is called the liar's paradox. And it's very easy. It goes, this statement is false. I can write it up on the board for you. This statement is false. Well, why is that a paradox? It's true, it's false, it's false, it's true. Precisely. It's a paradox because if the sentence is false, as it portends, then that makes it true, which is contradictory. But if it's true, then that makes it false. That's paradoxical. Okay? It runs counter to our intuition. So we need to be clear about the difference between contradictions and paradoxes and how they work together. Okay? Because we encounter these in logic. We also encounter gray areas. It's a situation in which the truth cannot be clearly established. We got to recognize that many things are, in fact, clearly and sharply defined. And not to see that is simply to not see clearly. If I were to tell you, for instance, that the keys are in my pocket, I keep using this easy example. Well, you guys have direct access to it. You can see it, you can hear it, I can hand it to you, you can feel it. To deny that would simply be to not think clearly, according to McIntyre. But not all statements are this clear. Does that make sense? There's a lot of gray area in the world. Gray can exist as gray only because there are the distinct alternatives of black and white. Some things are not as clear. The principle of sufficient reason tells us that things don't just happen. They are caused to happen. There's an explanation for why they happen. Just like in diagnosis, if I make a diagnosis, I'm offering a conclusion about some situation pertaining to a patient and their health and their physiology. But that has to be based on observed, objective fact. Okay? And of course, it can be very gray. But there also has to be some reason behind why that's the case. I can't just say the patient has sciatic radiculopathy or discogenic, sciatica, and it'd be a complete fabrication. I have to align myself with the principle of sufficient reason. There has to be some explanation behind that statement. Our search is given systematic direction by the principle that there is a certain rudimentary similarity between every cause and effect. What this means is, in terms of the cause, that it must be capable of bringing about just the kinds of effects that we're witnessing. And in doing so, it means its peculiar mark on the effect. That being the case, every effect to some degree or another reflects the nature of its cause. So if I were to make a diagnosis like the patient has discogenic low back pain, that's the effect. Okay? The principle of sufficient reason says that the cause that I provide has to fully explain the effect. If I can't make that connection between causes and effects, I'm thinking illogically, I'm misdiagnosing the patient. This is how it shows up in healthcare. In Stevenson's Article 19, he gives 3 phases of chiropractic study. The study of the immaterial, of the material, and the study of art. And here's how they relate. The study of the immaterial is the study of philosophy. That is to say, the study of intelligence, laws, causes and effects, rules and theories, functions, other abstractions. It's to gain knowledge of the group of principles underlying the science. The study of the material is the study of anatomy, histology, chemistry, etc. In order that the chiropractor knows something about the material and structure of the bodies, it is advisable for him to study these materials in order to understand the actions of structures and function, to better understand effects of causes, and to trace causes from effects. So, if we're going to apply the principle of sufficient reason and go from cause to effect and make an accurate diagnosis, we need both the immaterial, those are the laws, the rules, and we need the material, concrete, the blood, the bone, the disc, the nerve. And there has to be a direct correspondence between those ideas, which are immaterial, and the concrete reality of the body. Does that make sense? We talked a lot about causes. The Greek philosopher Aristotle identified 4 causes. And these are very useful to learn and to memorize. They can only help you. And we can end on this. With Aristotle's 4 causes, if you want to make a sculpture, like as we pictured here, you see a sculptor, you see a block of marble, and in that dotted line on the inside is the idea of what the sculpture is going to be. Does that make sense? If you want to go from a block of marble to a sculpture, an actual finished piece of art, you have to have the material cause. The material cause for Aristotle is the marble itself, the block of marble. Okay? The efficient cause is the artist, the sculptor, the one doing the work. The formal cause is what you see in the artist's mind. It's the idea of the sculpture once it's finished. The final cause is the actual finished piece. Does that make sense? So, anytime you go from cause to effect, you're dealing with Aristotle's 4 causes, in some sense. The efficient cause, which is the thing that's doing the changing, in this case the sculpture changing the marble. The material cause, which is the marble itself. The the formal cause, which is the idea, right? The idea of what the thing is going to be, and then the final cause, what it actually becomes. And there's all kinds of dispute about these causes in philosophy, but this is a good starting point for us. Now, what I want you guys to do between now and next week is to read Stevenson's introduction in the chiropractic textbook. Before we're done, I'm going to jump over to Blackboard. I'm going to show you some resources. Okay? In the Blackboard site for the course, you see a link here for chiropractic textbook. If you click on that, you have a fully downloadable PDF of the entire Green Book. Please read the introduction. When we get back together next week, we're going to pick up here with this. One more thing. There is an assignment that's due by the end of this week, Sunday at midnight. I've extended the deadline a little bit, but if you go to the week 1 folder, some of you have already done this.